welcome back to the Infodump of the series where I do a deep but not necessarily scholarly dive into a topic. This week we are, of course, continuing with our first topic of physics. Now, when we last left off, I basically did a little bit of a love letter to our boy Newton. That man really got way too much shit during his lifetime. Really didn't deserve it. But, be that as it may, we of course have to continue. Newton was not the only man to ever contribute to physics. He was definitely not the only man to make great strides in mathematics either. He was one of the ones who really helped to unify the two into a core pursuit. In fact, while Newton definitely considered himself a mathematician, you could argue that he was really more of a physicist. I certainly would be one to argue that. Keep in mind, this was in the days when the term science had not really been coined as we know it now. What it would be called then is natural philosophy. There's not really a concept of this sort of empirical, mathematical, law-driven, approach to knowledge and to the study of the world. Newton is one of the guys who helps create that with calculus. Now, all that out of the way, of course, we have to continue, because right after Newton came the Industrial Revolution and, of course, the Enlightenment. Now, really, the Enlightenment came first, so I kind of said those out of order, but hey, who cares? This is just me trying to help explain and understand things, and I feel like a lot more people are familiar with the specifics of the Industrial Revolution. I'm, of course, going to cover it second, but for now, we want to talk about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is when science really started taking off. The Royal Society, which Newton was part of, flourished. It's when you had people like Benjamin Franklin figuring out that lightning was just electricity and that it could travel through strings and such and through metal. You had, of course, the many, many works of multiple scientists and philosophers, because again, there was really no difference at the time, trying to come up with explanations for how things work. Words that exist and are named after people to this day. Words like galvanize, for instance, comes from the natural philosopher Galvan, who was studying things like electricity. You've also got, of course, basically, if it's a word that has to do with electricity, there's someone's name attached to it that comes along a little bit later than the early Enlightenment, of course. But you also have words like mesmerize, which comes from Mesmer, who was a German, now we would call him a scientist, or really a psychologist, but at the time, again, it was all just called philosophy, or natural philosophy. And his whole thing was trying to understand how the mind worked. And so he was one of the first, what you might consider professional hypnotists, trying to understand how all that worked. Of course, that was, again, very early in the Enlightenment. It was still really during the tail end of the scientific revolution. But a much bigger name that came around to that sort of broad period of time was, of course, Charles Darwin. Now, if you are listening to this and you, for whatever reason, don't believe in the theory of evolution, stop listening. This is not for you. I honestly don't know how you have managed to get to this point in human civilization, unable to understand that things change over time. Seriously. It's just, like, I'm astounded that there are still people who refuse to accept that evolution is a thing that exists and that happens, despite the fact that we can literally watch it in real fucking time. Yeah, there are multiple experiments in studying and guiding evolution currently ongoing. If you look at the entire history of things like selective breeding, whether crops or animals, or if you want to go really evil with it, attempts at forced eugenics and the like. You can see evolution in action. It's a fact. Get over it. So, outbursts aside, Darwin was, of course, not a physicist, but his approach, finding data and trying to figure out a conclusion and an explanation from the data, was relatively new. He wasn't the first to do it by any means, but the approach up until then had largely been, with a few crucial exceptions, to take an assumption and then look for data that fit it. Now, I do say with a few key assumptions, or a few key exceptions, but largely that had been the approach. Even when you were disproving something, you were operating on the assumption that the thing you were trying to disprove was wrong. Even when you were, of course, when it comes to how you would get to the conclusion that the thing is wrong in the first place, is just, well, this doesn't feel right, so I'm going to assume it's wrong. It's this very intuitive approach to science and to philosophy and just the world in general. And you can certainly see how it might work when you still don't have a very strong understanding of the world, but as more and more people learn more and more, we gradually develop through generational knowledge this better framework, this better understanding of how everything works. And so that brings us, of course, to Darwin. He saw a pattern that contradicted his beliefs. And rather than assuming that the pattern must be wrong, he decided, okay, clearly my pre-existing beliefs are incorrect here. Let's try and figure out what the reality is so that I can correct my beliefs. Now, it's worth noting, like I said, Darwin was a very strongly devout man, but also, again, back at that time, he was the first one to propose the idea of evolution, or at least the first one to gain any traction in doing so. He was a pioneer. He was proposing an idea that no one had ever really given any credence to before, even if it had been, tossed out by some people. And he looked for a way to syncretize, essentially, his beliefs with the reality that he was seeing. So that gave rise, Darwin's personal philosophy gave rise to the idea during the Enlightenment of what was called the watchmaker god. The idea that God is like a watchmaker. He has built his watch, the world, everything that exists, and then he has set it ticking. And occasionally, he has to go in and mess with it a little to keep it ticking the way that he wants to, but for the most part it just runs by itself, and he's just sort of content to sit there and watch and say, okay, yeah, I like what I've made here. That idea, the idea that there is not necessarily a direct divine cause for everything, gave rise to a huge bunch of advances, things like germ theory, for instance. But most importantly, it helped spur forward the development of physics. Because the idea of God having, created this world and the set of rules that it works by, and that is just how the world works, it's ticking like a watch based on those rules, well, then that means that if you're a devout person wanting to understand God and his creation, you should probably set about trying to understand those rules, because they are a fundamental part of that creation. Now, like I said, the idea that by understanding, God's creation, you could get closer to God, that was very much present in medieval times in Europe, and in, at the same time in the Muslim empires to the south. However, with the Protestant Reformation, that had kind of been kicked to the curbside. And it was more, if you do not listen to the clergy and you are Catholic, you're a heretic. If you do not, read the Bible and you are Protestant, you're a heretic. Everybody loves heresy conflicts, and and of course the Muslim empires were also having their own complete collapse from xenophobia around the same time. So yeah, the whole idea of studying the world to become closer to God was kind of thrown to the wayside because it was more, hey, look at these people, they're straying from God, we need to get them back on the right path, or just kill them. So, of course, with the Enlightenment and the idea of the watchmaker god, this approach of science and physics being the sort of holy pursuit came back. It didn't come back completely, of course, because it's worth noting that the doctrinal entrenchment, if you will, from the Protestant Reformation in particular, but also, again, in the Muslim countries, the hardening of xenophobia, had created this skepticism and hostility to any ideas that directly contradicted church doctrine. Now, of course, this was much less pronounced in Protestant countries because often there wasn't really much of an established church doctrine, and even if there was, the clergy was pretty powerless to actually enforce it on any scholars. So that certainly helped. But again, a lot of the development and the science that was coming out was from Catholic or Catholic-ish countries. So it's not as though this is a one-size-fits-all type thing where it's like, oh, Protestantism helped create science. No. The lack of direct religious interference helped science flourish, but science flourished whether there was direct interference or not. It's just a matter of how much and how well. And of course, with the Enlightenment, there was also the development of science as a respectable, not necessarily common man's profession, but a gentleman's profession. You had all these nobles who'd gotten rich off colonialism sitting around with nothing much better to do than read books and do experiments. And with how expensive the experiments could get sometimes, it was kind of a way of showing off both how knowledgeable and holy you were, because again, it was seen as somewhat of a holy pursuit trying to understand the divine creation, but also how rich you were. Because if you could, for instance, afford to set up a state-of-the-art laboratory taking up an entire, wing of your manor, well, you'd certainly be staging up all those lesser aristocrats trying to make do with little bedside tables of flasks and whatnot, and then you'd get completely shown up by the person who just had a new manor built for experiments. Really crazy time, the Enlightenment. It was where modern ideas of science and old ideas of tradition and feudalism sort of not just coexisted, but almost reinforced each other to an extent. Although, of course, that didn't last for super long because then the Industrial Revolution came along. But we'll get to that next week. The Enlightenment really was the most important time for the development of science. Yeah, more important than any of the stuff that came before. Because again, it saw the entry of science into the professional sphere. Granted, it was only for the upper classes and maybe some of the higher end of the middle class, but it was still seen as a, perhaps not official profession per se, but as a valid pastime. Whereas before it was just sort of a thing that some people who were kind of weird did, or a thing for the clergy. Now, again, that's mostly the case for European situations in the Muslim empires that I mentioned in the episode on the Muslim Golden Age. Well, things were a whole lot different because there was a lot of state sponsorship of the sciences. But even then, science was still seen as a religious or professional academics profession, rather than something that you could dabble in and still be, a respected socialite. And of course, as is often the case, the poor want what the rich have, no matter what it is. So, as science and scientific pursuits became more and more common and more popular among the upper classes, the fact that it was associated with the upper classes also meant that it started to become popular among the peasantry. Of course, you couldn't really afford much scientific kit if you weren't rich. But when it came to simpler experiments that anyone could do in their backyard, it was a whole lot easier. Now, this is of course by no means to say that every single person, or even a majority of the population, was interested in science or was doing science at this time. That's hardly the case. What is the case, though, is that science became something that people were interested in, and it became a field of its own rather than a subordinate part of philosophy. The Enlightenment really is the period when all the new ideas that had begun to develop through globalization, through increased trade, through gradually relaxing social norms, through the fragmenting of religious power and the consolidation and centralization of secular power, all of these gradual and very complicated societal changes helped build together to create an environment where science was both public and respected. And that is not something that has often happened. Especially in recent times, there tends to be a lot of skepticism towards science. That is part of why I wanted to make this series. I wanted to help get rid of some of that skepticism, help shed light on some of the stuff that's complicated. And I know that so far this has just been a history of physics, but don't worry, eventually we will get to actually explaining some of the concepts. It's just important to understand where the groundwork was laid. So, with that said, the fundamental difficulty in the Enlightenment when it came to science was making sure that you were doing your experiments right. Because there weren't very good controls at the time. And, well, even with a whole bunch of brilliant inventions and great ideas, some stuff slipped through the cracks, and some stuff was discovered purely due to those lax experimental constraints. Phosphorus, for instance, was created, or rather distilled for the first time, in an attempt to create the Philosopher's Stone, through extreme refinement of human urine. I'm not really sure where the guy got that idea, but eventually it led to the discovery of the element phosphorus. So that kind of worked out. But again, right? If it hadn't been for those fairly lax experimental constraints, that wouldn't have happened. But it would have been discovered in a less disgusting way anyway. Maybe it would have taken a little longer, maybe it could have even happened sooner, we can't really know. That's the difficult thing about sort of small-scale alternate history, is that we don't know many of the exact circumstances, and we can't really accurately imagine a lot of the alternative circumstances, even if we do know what actually happened to an accurate degree. Now, with the various discoveries coming out of the Enlightenment, like I said, there had also been a shift in the center of power. It had largely moved from the church to the state. And as a result, there was gradually a shift in funding for the sciences as well. Similarly to the way things had worked in ancient Rome before, the empire had collapsed, and the way things had worked, sort of, in the Muslim empires. But again, keep in mind, in the Muslim empires, there was a large overlap between church and state. So, kind of hard to talk about a separation there when that sort of separation was often more de facto than anything else. In fact, to an extent, there is a strong and long tradition of devout Muslim leaders trying to pretend that there is no separation of church and state when there is due to circumstances, because that undermines, secular authority to not have that religious backing. It's a very in-depth and complicated system, and I can't get into it really myself. I am definitely not an expert on Muslim government or theology or anything like that. I am just a guy who knows stuff about science and stuff about history. Now, with that said, the gradual shift in funding from church to state, alongside the shift in power from church to state, also meant that the results of the scientific experiments became more aligned with state interests than with church interests. Now, in the past, there had always been the risk of getting excommunicated or deemed a heretic, the way that Galileo was, if you came out with findings that contradicted church doctrine, or did so in a way that didn't seem like it was kowtowing to the church. But with the shift towards state power instead, you had to show deference and obedience to, well, whatever the state was, whether it was your local lord or the king, or if you happened to be lucky to live in a republic, whoever the leader of that republic was. Or the emperor, depends on what sort of government you live under. But ultimately, all of that led to a situation where really all you had to do was prove that your experiment, your theory, might lead to some scientific edge over other countries. Because, well, like I said, science had now become in part a gentleman's profession. It had become respectable. And with that respectability had come a sense of, well, propriety. Where if you are not this well-read, educated individual, well, you're not really fit to be a noble now, are you? Because being a scientist has now become part of being a noble in the Enlightenment feudal mindset. So, of course, that means that the bigger of a king you are, the smarter and more well-read you should be, damn it! And so that led to a sort of scientific arms race, with various countries trying to outdevelop scientifically each other in order to have sort of not only a technological leg up, but more importantly a social leg up. Because again, politics was still, perhaps not feudal per se, but it was still very much tied to manorialism. And whether you want to debate whether manorialism is part of feudalism or feudalism is just a manifestation of manorialism, doesn't matter. As long as you are under whichever of those systems you think is, the sort of bigger box, you fundamentally have to see politics and geopolitics as a sort of society writ large. Or, well, when I say society, I mean high society, where everything is this sort of game of prestige and social clout and influence and reputation, and there's really nothing behind that. It's just this, well, I have to be, more famous than anyone else, because otherwise, they won't like me, and they might invade me. So I need to look the part. I need to, tick all these boxes that we have artificially ascribed to good leadership, whether that be actual leadership qualities, or just having a lot of books in your library, or having a court philosopher / court scientist who routinely comes up with new discoveries that are in fact very accurate and almost eerily so sometimes. There were often whispers of, magic or witchcraft or, deals with the devil in order to get forbidden information, but most of the time that really did end up just being rumors spread about some particular noble or ruler who was really just kind of lucky, or maybe conducting a little bit of espionage in order to get the information they wanted. There's all sorts of geopolitics and intrigue and just general shenanigans related to this stuff. But more importantly, the broad level situation with the scientific world during the Enlightenment was nobles were now not just passively but actively trying to outdo each other in the realms of science and knowledge. And that meant a whole lot of money was getting poured into the sciences. Again, this is when we see the Royal Society really flourish. This is when we see all sorts of sort of competitor state colleges, more or less, being set up to give not a religious education, but a scientific and philosophical one, where it is essentially a way of training future scientists so that the crown will never have to hire someone from out of the country to be the court philosopher or court scientist, because that would just be admitting that some other country knows what they're doing more. And yeah, that was the way things happened to go a lot. But fortunately, that ended up being a fairly, more or less, fairly simple thing to do on the part of the state in order to create this huge development, this huge growth spurt, if you will, in science, in, learning and education. And whether you like or dislike the modern education system of your country today, just about all of them are developed from that original need to train people to have this understanding so that the king doesn't look bad. I just find it very funny. Anyway, with that said, it's also worth noting that there were many, many fraudsters out there, as of course there always have been in science. I mean, Aristotle, right? We talked about how he never actually did experiments, and yet everyone believed him because he was charismatic and really good at persuasion. He wrote the book on persuasion, actually. Now, we can't really say for sure how many and who and all that, because a lot of it has been lost to time, and of course, nobles would try and destroy records of them having been conned in order to save face. Because yeah, both of those things happen a lot, them being conned and them needing to save face. So, we end up with a few big names that stick out in science, and less so in physics, because keep in mind, at this point in time, science is sort of in an undifferentiated state. The term scientist was actually coined to describe a particular woman who had achieved a ridiculous level of knowledge for the time in, I believe it was 8 separate subjects. And that was really where we get our modern vocabulary of science and scientists from. The idea that there is more than just the philosophy and understanding, there is also the knowledge. That is what science means in Latin. Knowledge. So, with her, and with many other scientists throughout that time, we get this development of, science. Of the idea of knowledge for knowledge's sake, and if not for knowledge's sake, then at least for the sake of being able to gloat about how much knowledge we have. Which is kind of knowledge's sake, if you twist things a little and put a little bit of egomania in there, where maybe some might argue it doesn't exactly belong. But that sort of gratuitous knowledge is part and parcel of, well, the Enlightenment. It's what makes it called the Enlightenment. It was this geopolitical and sort of sub-political endorsement of the sciences on many levels that led not only to great advancement, but also to sharing of that advancement. Because, like I said, nobles wanted to brag. And also, having some physical proof of what they were bragging about helped them back it up and helped reinforce that sort of image of prestige that they were trying to cultivate. So it's really just, again, a bunch of different things coming together to reinforce each other. And I think that really is what science should be. Not the prestige part, not anything like that, but the idea that there's these multiple different reasons why we are studying this. Perhaps some of them are more valid than others, but we can all agree that these things need to be studied, these things need to be researched, we need to learn these things. And we are all trying our darndest to actually learn them. Regardless of things like political disputes, regardless of cultural differences, regardless of religious differences, regardless of ideological differences, we have found this piece of common ground that is a desire for knowledge, at least on this particular subject. Of course, it's also worth mentioning here, even though this is kind of a footnote. The Enlightenment was a time of a great deal of scientific progress, but that also means it was a time of less than ethical practices. This was definitely well before any sort of ethics or oversight boards were established. Remember what I said about the lax experimental standards earlier? Yeah, that didn't just apply to things like safety for the person doing the experiment. It also applied to safety of the people being experimented on, or even just their basic human rights. Of course, that certainly hasn't stopped, but in the Enlightenment, people rarely even tried to hide it. There was, again, that very strong feudal and manorial classism that led to the idea that, well, these peasants deserve no better than to be used as our mere property and whatnot. So, a lot of experiments that we would definitely consider inhumane were conducted. A lot more were conducted afterwards as well. It is fortunate that physics has basically nothing to do with the human body, except in the specific realms of stuff like biochemistry and biophysics. But, well, even though physics was able to get out with only a little bit of blood on its hands, other realms of science weren't exactly so lucky. And that is something that we have to reckon with. That is part of that sort of breach of trust. Those ethical infringements are part of why there is suspicion around science today. It is the biggest skeleton in our closet. As scientists, whether we are professional or just citizen scientists, we all have to reckon with the fact that the pursuit of knowledge has many times not necessarily been taken too far, but been taken recklessly. And we should be careful not to do the same ourselves. Because when we do, we only hurt the credibility of ourselves and the knowledge that we obtain. So, as somber as a note as that is to end on, that is all for this week. And I will see you all next time.